February 19, 1944. Underground Command Bunker, Rabaul, New Britain. Vice Admiral Janisai Kusaka's hand shook slightly as he jotted down notes in his personal journal, entries that could have landed him in serious trouble if discovered by Imperial headquarters. The Americans are not engaging us. They are suffocating us. Every bypassed garrison adds another burden pulling the Empire towards its downfall. Through a small ventilation shaft, Kusaka heard the distant hum of B-24 liberators, which had become as routine as dawn since the Americans decided Rabaul was no longer worth capturing. Over 100,000 Japanese troops, comprising the best soldiers and sailors of the Imperial Army and Navy, were idle on this volcanic island, watching American forces sail past en route to Japan. Once a formidable fortress and major fleet base, Rabaul, the most heavily fortified Japanese position in the South Pacific, was being systematically dismantled without an invasion. What Kusaka feared more than any suicidal charge or naval bombardment was a new kind of warfare that made traditional Japanese defense tactics obsolete. The Americans were not adhering to the principles of Bushido. They were not seeking glorious battles. Instead, they were methodically weakening the Japanese Empire through calculated neglect, transforming strength into weakness and fortresses into prisons. Defeat was being plotted not in casualty reports, but in shipping manifests that would never arrive, airfields that would never again launch a Zero fighter, soldiers who would die from disease, starvation, and irrelevance rather than American bullets. The Japanese Pacific defense strategy had been devised with mathematical precision and symmetry by the Imperial General Headquarters, appealing to military minds. Each island fortress was meant to be an unsinkable aircraft carrier, each garrison a barrier against the advancing Americans. The enemy would be forced to assault these positions, bleeding themselves dry against Japanese steel and spirit. In September 1943, Lieutenant General Heideki Tojo had announced the establishment of the Absolute National Defense Zone, defined by a perimeter including Sakhalin Island's southern half, the Kuril Islands, the Bonin Islands, the Mariana Islands, Western New Guinea, Malaya, and Burma. Every strongpoint would be held until the last soldier stood. Every island turned into an impregnable fortress, compelling the Americans to pay in blood for each meter of sand they advanced. At Rabaul, General Hitoshi Imamura commanded 50,000 elite troops from the 8th Area Army. The harbor was fortified with 367 anti-aircraft guns. 5 airfields capable of deploying hundreds of aircraft were operational. Among these were Lucknow and Vulnerkano, which had served as pre-war Australian airstrips, while Rapopo became functional in December 1942. Featuring concrete runways and comprehensive maintenance facilities. Tobara was completed in August 1943. Extensive underground tunnels linked defensive positions, hospitals, and supply depots dug into volcanic rock. In November 1943, Imamura reported to Tokyo that Rabaul was impregnable, predicting the Americans would crash against their defenses like waves on a concrete wall. However, neither he nor Imperial Command realized that the Americans had no plans for a grand confrontation. This realization began in June 1943 under the guise of victory. When American forces landed on Woodlark and Kiriwina Islands on June 30, Japanese commanders initially believed it was a minor setback. Captain Toshio Takahashi, the intelligence officer at Rabaul, noted that the Americans seemed hesitant to engage in serious combat against well-defended positions. However, something about the pattern unsettled him. The Americans were not just targeting weak defenses, they were deliberately selecting islands from which to build air bases. Woodlark and Kiriwina Islands provided strategic locations for aerial support of operations unrelated to attacking nearby Japanese strongholds. The unease intensified when American forces invaded New Georgia on June 30, 1943. With 10,500 troops stationed around the crucial Munda airfield, the Japanese were prepared for a major engagement. Following intense combat that extended into August, the Americans gained control of the airfield but halted their advance there. They refrained from pursuing the withdrawing Japanese troops and did not attempt to conquer the whole island. Instead, they fortified Munda and proceeded elsewhere. Major Kenji Hatano, a survivor of the New Georgia campaign, reported back to Rabaul. It is evident that American tactics differ. They seize what is essential while leaving the rest untouched. It appears as though we hold no significance for them. By November 1943, the pattern was distressingly apparent. Operation Cartwheel, an Allied offensive, aimed not at seizing Japanese bases, but rather at rendering them obsolete. Admiral Mainichi Koga, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, reacted to the Allied invasion of Bougainville by dispatching carrier aircraft to Rabaul. On November 1, 1943, he transferred 173 carrier planes, including 8 E-20s, 45 Type 99 dive bombers, 40 Type 97 torpedo bombers, and 6 reconnaissance planes from the carriers Zuikaku, Shikaku, Zuihu, Junnyo, Hyo, and Ryuhu to reinforce Rabaul. These were Japan's last trained carrier pilots, veterans who had attacked Pearl Harbor, battled the British at Singapore, and fought fiercely at Midway. They represented the cutting edge of Japanese naval aviation, now committed to defending a base that the Americans had already decided not to target. The American response was swift and brutal. On November 5, aircraft from USS Saratoga and USS Princeton attacked Rabaul, severely damaging 4 heavy and 2 light cruisers. 5 days later, Essex, Bunker Hill, and Independence returned with even more destructive force, crippling most of the remaining warships. However, it was what transpired afterward that initiated a psychological unraveling among Japanese commanders. The Americans did not launch an invasion. They failed to capitalize on their success and merely departed after destroying 121 of the 173 carrier aircraft and killing 82 out of 193 aircrew members. Commander Yasuo Kuhara, a Zero fighter pilot who survived the November battles, expressed his confusion in a letter found after the war. "We won. We drove them away. Yet why do I feel like we lost?" The destruction to our ships and aircraft, coupled with the inability to retaliate or pursue, left us stranded, awaiting their next move. Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Ami, serving as a senior staff officer of the Southeast Area Fleet, meticulously documented the real-world implications of the bypass strategy. His classified reports, uncovered after the war, reveal a grim mathematical decline in strategic capability. In November 1943, Rabaul received 30,000 tons of supplies monthly with fuel reserves at 60% and ammunition sufficient for 6 months of combat operations. By December 1943, supply convoys faced increasing challenges from American submarines, which sank 2 vessels for every one that reached Rabaul. Monthly deliveries dropped to 18,000 tons. In January 1944, no surface vessels had arrived in 3 weeks. Submarine deliveries were the only source of supplies, providing a mere 2,000 tons this month and reducing fuel reserves to just 30%. By February 1944, the Japanese High Command acknowledged the futility of reinforcing Rabaul with fighter or bomber aircraft and ceased provisioning the isolated garrison. The stark reality was undeniable. Without supplies, even a powerful fortress becomes an inescapable prison. Captain Takedo Takagi, commanding a destroyer squadron at Rabaul, grappled with this impossible dilemma. With just enough fuel for a single significant mission, the question remained, where could he go? By February 1944, the Americans had captured the Admiralty Islands, completing their encirclement of Rabaul. All directions pointed to enemy-controlled waters. "We are a fleet that cannot sail," he wrote, "warriors who cannot fight. We exist merely as a facade of military might, pretending to pose a threat while the real war unfolds without us." The Americans had figured out that Japanese island garrisons could be defeated by the sheer nature of their environment. Each bypassed island turned into an inhospitable wasteland, where the jungle, disease, and malnutrition did the work of infantry divisions. Dr. Shigeaki Yamachi, chief medical officer at Rabaul, recorded the gradual deterioration of combat efficiency. In December 1943, malaria cases were rising, with adequate medical supplies and quinine reserves for 4 months. Combat readiness was at 85%. By March 1944, 30% of garrisons suffered from malaria, dengue fever, or dysentery. Quinine stocks had run out. Local bark substitutes offered limited relief. Combat readiness dropped to 60%. In June 1944, malnutrition became the primary concern. Rice rations were cut to 400 grams daily. Soldiers supplemented their diet with jungle plants, many of which were toxic, resulting in 17 deaths from poisonous vegetation that month. Combat readiness further declined to 40%. The Americans had weaponized time itself. Every day weakened Japanese garrisons while American forces grew stronger, hopping from island to island, constructing airfields and ports, establishing a victorious infrastructure as Japanese strongholds decayed in tropical isolation. Captain Shigematsu Sakaibara commanded around 4,000 Japanese troops on Wake Island, which had been bypassed since October 1943. Once crucial for trans-Pacific flights, Wake had become a heavily fortified position with coastal guns, anti-aircraft weapons, and underground bunkers. The Americans simply ignored it. Although Sakaibara was promoted to Rear Admiral in October 1944, his command was already irrelevant by then. His reports to Tokyo, sent via submarine-delivered radio parts, grew increasingly dire. In November of 1943, enemy carrier aircraft attacked installations supporting an anticipated invasion force, with all positions fully manned and prepared for action. By January 1944, no invasion had materialized. Instead, enemy ships sailed bi-weekly, out of range of our coastal artillery, prompting us to request further instructions. By April 1944, the food situation was dire. Fishing provided some relief, but was inadequate to sustain the garrison. Many men exhibited signs of malnutrition, and we wondered when help would arrive. On WWII Atoll in the Caroline Islands, approximately 26 Japanese troops under Major General Katsumi Kitamura faced a similar predicament. The Americans had captured neighboring islands for airfields, but left WWII's garrison to deteriorate on its own. Post-war analysis of Kitamura's diary revealed the psychological toll endured by his men. On March 31, 1944, an enemy task force passed close enough to be seen through binoculars, but remained out of reach of our guns. They seemed to consider us unworthy targets for destruction. On May 15, 1944, we received a radio message stating that all available forces were being consolidated for a decisive battle. However, we were not included in these plans. This realization left us feeling abandoned and isolated. By August 2, 1944, soldiers had started cultivating gardens to ensure survival. This was unprecedented work for the garrison, but necessity demanded it. I fear we are transforming into farmers rather than maintaining our role as soldiers. American carrier raids that occasionally targeted bypassed bases served purposes beyond physical damage. These attacks were psychological operations meant to remind Japanese garrisons of their powerlessness and isolation. At Truk, Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific, about 27,000 troops, and the Fourth Fleet had established what strategists believed was an impregnable stronghold. During Operation Hailstone from February 17th to 18th, 1944, the U.S. Navy's Fast Carrier Task Force launched extensive air raids that destroyed over 250 aircraft, sank 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, damaged or sunk 32 merchant ships totaling 200,000 tons, and caused the deaths of approximately 45 Japanese personnel. Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi, commanding at Truk, experienced a commander's worst nightmare, being rendered ineffective. His report to Combined Fleet Headquarters highlighted the psychological impact on his troops. The American carriers emerged unexpectedly, dealt devastating blows, and disappeared without a trace. We were unable to pursue them or retaliate. We could only endure the damage and wait for their next attack. This is not conventional warfare, but rather an endless torment. The pattern persisted throughout the Pacific, hitting targets like Marcus Island, Palau, and Yap with striking regularity. Each location endured carrier strikes frequently enough to disrupt defensive preparations, yet infrequently enough to deny Japanese commanders the battles they sought. The invasion of Saipan in July 1944 demonstrated the effectiveness of the American island-hopping strategy. On June 15, 1944, American forces launched a massive assault with over 300,000 troops and more than 500 ships. However, what truly unnerved Japanese strategists was not this direct attack, but rather the untouched fortresses that remained. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Seida received his final situation report on July 6, 1944, before leading his last Banzai charge. The report detailed the isolation and vulnerability of various garrisons, 27,000 troops trapped with no naval support at Truk, 100,000 troops cut off from supplies and reduced to farming in Rabaul, 4,000 soldiers surviving by fishing on Wake Island, another 4,000 facing a critical water shortage on Marcus Island, and 6426 troops on WWII teetering on the brink of starvation. More than 200,000 Japanese soldiers armed with thousands of tons of ammunition, hundreds of aircraft, and sophisticated defenses found themselves in an untenable situation as American forces advanced toward Japan. These weren't merely casualties. They were once valuable military assets that had become liabilities. When Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurabayashi arrived at Iwo Jima in June 1944, he brought with him a novel approach shaped by his observations of the island-hopping campaign. He quickly concluded that holding Iwo Jima was unfeasible and anticipated an imminent American invasion. Unlike previous commanders who aimed for victory, Kurabayashi focused on inflicting maximum damage to achieve strategic objectives. After studying the fates of bypassed garrisons, he understood the tactical realities perfectly. Instead of setting up defenses at the beaches to directly contest landings, he opted for a defense-in-depth strategy, directing the construction of 18 kilometers of tunnels and over 5,000 cave positions throughout the island. In a letter to his wife that would only be delivered after his death, Kurabayashi articulated his plan. "I do not fight to win, as this is impossible. I fight to make the Americans pay such a high price that they will hesitate before invading Japan." Each Marine killed on Iwo Jima was one less who could invade the homeland. The soldiers were fighting not just for Iwo Jima, but for the defense of Japan itself. This marked a significant shift in Japanese military thought, with Kurabayashi explicitly prohibiting Banzai charges until the final stages, viewing them as futile, and ordering every soldier to prolong their resistance as long as possible before being killed. The island-hopping strategy demonstrated to Japanese commanders that heroism alone did not serve strategic purposes if it failed to achieve objectives. Gradually, Japanese leaders recognized that American forces had fundamentally altered warfare through a new form of military logistics that rendered traditional defensive positions obsolete. Commander Chihiya Takahashi, a staff officer analyzing American operations, wrote a report that was suppressed by Imperial headquarters. The Americans do not capture islands. They create mobile bases. Every captured atoll turns into a fuel depot, every lagoon and anchorage serves as a strategic base, and each airstrip represents an extension of power across the Pacific. The Liberty ships were reaching peak production with 3 vessels being built daily. Meanwhile, Japanese garrisons had to meticulously ration their remaining rice supplies, while American construction battalions were pouring concrete for runways capable of handling 100-ton bombers. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor attack, examined American logistics from his position in Tokyo and arrived at a grim realization. We prepared for a war fought by warriors, but they are waging a war through engineering prowess. While we refine the art of dying bravely, they perfect the science of supply management. Every bypassed garrison weakens us further, while each new airfield bolsters their strength. Time has become our greatest adversary. The island-hopping strategy was reinforced by the American submarine campaign, which turned Japanese resupply efforts into perilous missions. By 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese vessels at a rate faster than they could be replaced. Admiral Naokuni Nomura, overseeing submarine operations from Truk, documented the impossibility of supporting bypassed garrisons with resupply missions. In January 1944, Eminis 169 was lost during an attempt to deliver supplies to the Bougainville garrison, resulting in a loss of 40 tons of provisions. In February, Eminis 43 suffered damage from aircraft while approaching Rabaul and had to abort its mission. By March, Eminis 42 was sunk while attempting to evacuate key personnel from Wake Island. Finally, in April, submarine resupply missions were suspended indefinitely due to the high risk involved. Submarines that once served as lifelines for isolated garrisons became too valuable to risk further damage or loss. Each fortress left behind was truly cut off and alone. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 underscored the dire consequences of the island-hopping strategy on Japanese naval aviation capabilities. Japan had already suffered heavy losses with 121 out of 173 seasoned carrier pilots perishing while defending Rabaul, leaving the carrier fleet bereft of its most skilled aviators. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who led the mobile fleet, found himself in a dire predicament as his carriers were now filled with inexperienced pilots, many having less than 100 hours of flight time. The veteran instructors who could have trained them were either dead or trapped on bypassed islands. This situation culminated in the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot on June 19-20, 1944, where Japanese losses included approximately 550 to 600, and 45 aircraft destroyed and 3 fleet carriers sunk, Teiho, Shikaku, and Hiyo, with about 3,000 personnel killed. American casualties amounted to just 123 aircraft and 109 lives lost. The significant disparity in the kill ratio highlighted not only American superiority, but also Japanese degradation due to the bypass strategy. In his after-action report, Ozawa lamented that, "We have carriers without pilots, pilots without experience, and experience without opportunities to gain it." He further noted that the enemy's strategy has rendered us incapable of achieving victory. By Eminis 1944, a bizarre transformation was taking place within the bypassed Japanese garrisons. Elite combat units trained for years in the art of warfare were now struggling for survival as agricultural communes. On Rabaul, General Imamura issued orders that would have been considered absurd just 2 years prior. Effective immediately, All units will allocate 50% of daylight hours to food production. Each soldier must cultivate 100 square meters of vegetables. Unit commanders will be assessed based on their agricultural yield rather than combat readiness. Recognizing that the Americans had chosen a blockade strategy over an invasion, Imamura ordered the cultivation of fields to accumulate harvests. The fortress of Rabaul, originally built to pose a threat to Allied operations across the Pacific, had transformed into a vast prison farm. Colonel Norio Kishimoto, commanding an infantry regiment, wrote in his diary, "My samurai ancestors would weep to see us now. We who trained to die gloriously in battle now tend sweet potatoes and raise chickens. The Americans have not only defeated us, but also rendered our efforts utterly meaningless." Similar situations unfolded throughout the Pacific theater. On WWII, soldiers were raising pigs, while others fished using makeshift nets on Truk Island. Wake saw attempts to cultivate vegetables in coral sand mixed with human waste. The once formidable Imperial Japanese Army, which had conquered large parts of Asia, found itself reduced to subsistence farming. One of the harshest aspects of the island-hopping strategy was that it often took months or even years for isolated commanders to fully comprehend their predicament. Radio communications with Tokyo continued, and orders were still being issued, as were promotions. The illusion of military significance persisted despite starkly divergent realities on the ground. General Imamura in Rabaul received operational directives from Imperial General Headquarters as late as December 1944, instructing him to prepare for coordinated offensives alongside Philippine operations and maintain readiness to disrupt enemy supply lines. The absurdity of such orders, a garrison that hadn't seen a supply ship in 8 months being tasked with offensive maneuvers, highlights the disconnect between High Command's perception and battlefield reality. By April 1944, Rabaul had witnessed its last Japanese submarine departure, its final surface vessel leaving port, and no aircraft taking off for over a month. By early 1945, the bypass strategy reached its most cruel phase. Although there were no explicit operations targeting gardens, American forces occasionally bombed agricultural efforts by isolated garrisons. B-24 bombers destroyed cultivated fields, fighter sweeps machine-gunned fishing boats, and even survival attempts were thwarted. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamaguchi, an agricultural officer on WWII, documented 6 months of labor obliterated in 10 minutes. The corn nurtured from seeds and vegetables watered with drinking rations all burned to ashes. The Americans did not bomb our gun positions or ammunition dumps. They targeted our food supplies, knowing precisely what they were doing. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, around 300,000 Japanese troops remained stranded on bypassed islands. Rabaul alone harbored approximately 69,000 Japanese soldiers when the war ended. These individuals managed to endure not by engaging in combat, but through gardening, fishing, and gradually succumbing to hunger. The act of surrendering gave rise to a bizarre scenario. Numerous isolated garrisons doubted the validity of the surrender proclamation, dismissing it as American propaganda. Some, even if they believed the announcement, found themselves unable to surrender due to their remote locations with no presence of American forces. Colonel Masashi Yamamoto on Mili Atoll in the Marshall Islands exemplified this predicament. "The war is over, yet we have nobody to turn ourselves over to. The Americans completely bypassed us, essentially forgetting that we exist." They were forced to wait passively until remembered by Allied troops. Some garrisons endured weeks or even months before American forces arrived to accept their surrender. In the interim period, they found themselves in an unusual state of limbo, no longer actively participating in the conflict, but not yet officially at peace. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who masterminded the Central Pacific Campaign, later mused on the island-hopping strategy. We discovered that avoiding direct confrontations with Japanese forces was often the most efficient way to defeat them. Each bypassed island translated into thousands of soldiers we didn't need to engage and potentially kill, tons of ammunition conserved, and countless American lives spared. By employing this tactic, they effectively turned Japan's own strength against itself. General Douglas MacArthur, who initially resisted bypassing significant targets, eventually acknowledged the strategic brilliance of this approach. His shift in perspective was particularly pronounced after recognizing how the decision to bypass Rabaul had saved an immense number of Allied casualties. Perhaps the most revealing critique came from Admiral Matome Ugaki, Chief of Staff for the Combined Fleet, who jotted down in his diary in February 1945, "The Americans have devised a flawless strategy that undermines the very essence of the Japanese warrior spirit. Their actions have rendered our courage obsolete, our defenses ineffective, and our preparations meaningless. We were ready to die with honor, yet they forced us into a life of disgrace. This is not just defeat, it is annihilation." The strategic mathematics behind the island-hopping campaign demonstrate its overwhelming success. Japanese forces were bypassed, leaving Rabaul with 100,000 troops initially reduced to 69,000 at surrender. At Truk Island, approximately 27,000 troops faced a similar fate, while WWII saw only 6426 troops dwindling down to just 1,650 survivors who surrendered. Wake and Marcus Islands each had around 4,000 troops. Other garrisons in the region totaled tens of thousands more. In total, an estimated 300,000 Japanese soldiers were neutralized without significant combat engagement. The strategic bypassing of the 26 major Japanese bases proved highly effective. None of these isolated bases managed to hinder American operations afterward. The true triumph of the island-hopping strategy was psychological rather than military in nature. It shattered the core beliefs of Japanese military doctrine, which always aimed for decisive battles where spiritual superiority would compensate for material inferiority. However, the Americans deliberately avoided engaging in such confrontations. Japan had invested decades fortifying Pacific islands. The Americans proved that fortifications are only significant if they face an assault. Japanese military tradition celebrated death in battle. The Americans, however, imposed a fate of irrelevance and survival upon them. Japanese strategic thinking held that superior resolve could triumph over material disadvantages. Yet the Americans rendered such determination moot. Captain Yoshitaka Shindo, serving as an intelligence officer on Marcus Island after its bypass, penned one of the most insightful analyses. "We were ready for American power and technology, but we were unprepared for their disregard. The Japanese warrior cannot engage in a fight he is ignored in." By late 1944, some Japanese commanders started to grasp and adapt to this new reality, though it was already too late. Lieutenant General Kurabayashi at Iwo Jima had studied the island-hopping campaign and tailored his defensive strategy accordingly. His aim was not to secure victory, but to make any attack so costly that the United States would reconsider its plan to invade Japan. This approach, which abandoned traditional tactics such as banzai charges and beach defenses, embraced an entirely new paradigm of warfare. Instead, he focused on fighting from intricate tunnel networks, extending what was expected to be a 5-day battle into 36 days, while inflicting nearly 26,000 American casualties, including 6,821 killed. General Holland Smith described Kurabayashi as the most formidable adversary in the Pacific theater. Likewise, the defense of Okinawa in 1945 showcased Japanese adaptation to lessons learned from island hopping. Rather than attempting outright defeat of an invasion force, the defenders aimed to make it so costly that the United States would seek a negotiated peace rather than pressing on with an assault. The greatest irony was that Japan's own tenacity was used against itself in this strategy. Each garrison left behind that refused to yield, every soldier who picked death over disgrace, and each leader who adhered to orders demanding absolute defense became unwitting captives of their own choices. The Americans anticipated these isolated units would swiftly capitulate, yet many endured far longer than expected by cultivating crops and collaborating with the local populace. Though this perseverance could have been viewed as commendable fortitude, it merely prolonged their hardship and rendered them obsolete. Reflecting on the war after its conclusion, General Imamura remarked that they were ensnared by their own code of conduct. Surrender was inconceivable. Retreat was not an option, so they persisted in place. The Americans did not need to defeat these garrisons. It was the inability to adapt to the enemy's tactics that led to their downfall. The cessation of hostilities brought no relief, but rather confusion for these bypassed units. At Rabaul on September 6, 1945, General Imamura and Admiral Kusaka formally surrendered aboard HMS Glory, though their forces had been militarily irrelevant for over a year. Smaller garrisons often experienced even more peculiar endings. On the island of Atahan, 32 Japanese soldiers refused to accept that the war was over and continued engaging in battles against non-existent enemies until 1951. They maintained strict military discipline, conducted patrols, and prepared for an American invasion that had been canceled 6 years prior. These holdouts epitomized the psychological toll of being rendered strategically obsolete. So thoroughly negated were their combat roles that they could not fathom a world where they no longer mattered. Beyond strategic implications, the island-hopping strategy inflicted a particularly cruel form of suffering on Japanese forces. Combat, though horrific, at least offered some sense of purpose, dying for the emperor or sacrificing oneself for the nation. The bypassed garrisons were denied even this grim comfort. Private Kazuo Sakamaki, stationed at WWII, wrote, "We do not fear death, we fear meaninglessness." Each day they wake up, conduct military drills for battles that will never happen, maintain weapons that will never be fired, and pretend to be soldiers when in reality they are prisoners of their own rigid adherence. Medical records from these isolated garrisons reveal the human toll, with malnutrition affecting 80% of troops. The prevalence of diseases surpassed 60%, and psychological disorders were widespread. Suicide rates escalated dramatically compared to those in combat units. The island-hopping strategy fundamentally altered warfare, influencing military tactics well beyond World War II. It illustrated that controlling strategic points did not equate to dominating a region. This approach disrupted conventional military doctrines and demonstrated that superior supply lines and industrial capabilities could neutralize any tactical advantage. Time itself became a strategic asset. By accelerating their operations while slowing those of the enemy, the Americans transformed the passage of time into an effective weapon. Perhaps most significantly, it showed that psychological impact could be more devastating than physical damage. In 1965, 20 years after the war's conclusion, former General Hitoshi Imamura released his memoirs. Following his conviction for war crimes, he constructed a replica of his prison cell in his garden and resided there until his death in 1968, donating all earnings from his writings to the families of Allied prisoners who perished under his command. His reflection on the island-hopping strategy was both professional and deeply personal. He wrote that they had studied Napoleon, Clausewitz, Sun Tzu, preparing for every conceivable form of warfare. Yet the Americans devised a new paradigm: warfare by avoidance and victory through irrelevance. At Rabaul, I commanded 100,000 of Japan's finest soldiers with extensive ammunition reserves and fortifications capable of withstanding any assault. Despite our determination to fight until the last man, none of these advantages ultimately mattered. The Americans sailed past us en route to Japan, leaving us in a state of helpless observation. We were like phantoms patrolling areas devoid of significance, defending land with no strategic worth, and awaiting battles that would never materialize. Their brilliance lay in this approach. They compelled us to undermine ourselves. Each day we maintained our posts only served to weaken Japan further. Every soldier tending vegetable gardens at Rabaul was a man not guarding the homeland. We were neither defeated nor conquered. We were rendered inconsequential. Future military leaders should study the American island-hopping strategy, not merely for its tactical excellence, but for its revolutionary strategic insight. It demonstrated that the most effective way to neutralize an enemy position is not through direct confrontation, but by rendering it irrelevant. The true path to victory lies in redefining what constitutes success itself. We were paralyzed by our own powerlessness and feared the void left by our absence on the battlefield. For a lifetime, we had prepared for glorious deaths in combat. Instead, the Americans condemned us to a life of futile isolation. No warrior code could have readied us for such irrelevance. As warriors steeped in ancient traditions, we faced an adversary from the future. They did not defeat our strategies. They rendered strategy itself obsolete. This was the genuine horror of the island-hopping campaign. It exposed the fallacy of everything we believed about warfare. The most compelling evidence of the psychological impact of the island-hopping strategy was provided by Lieutenant Hiro Hinoda, who kept fighting on Lubang Island in the Philippines until 1974, nearly 3 decades after World War II ended. Arriving at Lubang on December 26, 1944, with strict orders never to surrender, Hinoda endured alone for years after his fellow soldiers had fallen. On March 9, 1974, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, his former superior officer, flew to Lubang and officially relieved him of duty. The following day, on March 10, 1974, Hinoda surrendered with a fully operational rifle, over 500 rounds of ammunition, and a uniform that had remained untouched for 3 decades. When questioned about his prolonged resistance, Hinoda explained, "I was waiting for the war to return to me. I never envisioned it would leave me behind permanently." The Japanese were deeply terrified by America's island-hopping tactics, which went beyond mere defeat. They symbolized a sense of purposelessness. All military traditions, cultural values, and strategic assumptions crumbled under this new approach. Instead of engaging in combat as expected, the enemy bypassed their fortified islands entirely, rendering them obsolete. Approximately 300,000 Japanese troops stationed on bypassed islands did not merely lose the war. They were essentially forgotten. As these soldiers held their ground, cultivated crops, and gradually starved, the conflict progressed without them. They faced neither defeat nor conquest, but a form of neglect. In his last entry before Japan's surrender, Admiral Kusaka at Rabaul noted, "The Americans have taught us the most cruel lesson in war. There is something worse than dying heroically on the battlefield, and that is being rendered irrelevant in victory." These soldiers, once esteemed as the emperor's finest warriors, found themselves tending to sweet potato fields while Allied forces sailed past them toward Japan. They were prepared for glorious death, but instead endured a life devoid of meaning. The island-hopping strategy succeeded not by attacking physical positions or personnel, but by undermining Japanese resolve and purpose. It transformed the Pacific Ocean from a battlefield into a strategic corridor, turning once formidable strongholds into self-imposed prisons. This approach was its ultimate weapon, effectively making obsolescence more devastating than any bomb or bullet could ever be. The fear it instilled did not stem from its actions, but rather from its inactions. It failed to offer the combat that Japanese warriors yearned for, refused to recognize their sacrifices, and completely ignored their presence. Instead, it bypassed them entirely, leaving these warriors to realize that being rendered insignificant was worse than death itself. The soldiers of Japan learned that as the sun set on their empire, its shadows grew longest, and within those shadows, forgotten legions gradually vanished into obscurity, not vanquished by foes but by neglect. They had witnessed the future of warfare, a realm where they held no significance whatsoever.